Hi there, welcome back to Indycar on Sunday. My name's Gordon Ross. Today I'm broadcasting from Partick. The subject of today's show is not so much about news, but rather about something on the radio this morning which provoked quite a strong reaction from me when I first heard it. On Radio 4 this morning, a guest was invited to deliver an essay. And the essay was on the subject of British nostalgia and how the British people look back at their history, particularly the history of their wars and empire, with kind of rosy or rose-tinted glasses. It was an interesting exercise because the essay had been written by a young African Englishwoman who, to be fair to her, had given a very balanced opinion about the British tendency to indulge in nostalgia. But it was a worrying essay in many ways because, as she was pointing out, British people tend to view the time of the Empire as a time when Britain was a kind of small but beneficent nation which was going forth to help poor backward countries to develop their democracies and to build schools and churches and so forth, and how wonderful all that was. In reality, as she was pointing out, they gloss over the fact that most of these countries were ruthlessly exploited for the resources, and in many cases their people were effectively indentured and became slaves to the British Empire, or became servants of it. And it caused no end of division, and particularly in places like India, for example, where some of the Indian castes took to the British way of life with great gusto, because the British class system merged almost seamlessly with the Indian caste system, both of which were based on a class structure where there were those at the top in the elite and there were those at the bottom who did all the menial and unpleasant tasks. And so the British Raj, as it was known, the British Empire in India, developed quite a cosy relationship with the upper caste in India. But it, as the writer was pointing out, British people tend to view this period as some kind of glorious golden age, when in fact the country was, as I say, ruthlessly exploiting its foreign conquests. And despite bringing democracy to India, which is probably the only good thing that we really did in India, we can't really hold that up to the light of day and say with nostalgia that it was any kind of golden era. It wasn't a golden era at all. Britain was basically taking over as much of the rest of the world as it could possibly manage to do. France, of course, and Holland were also guilty of it, and Spain to a large extent, particularly in South America, and every European country was at it. But the point is that nowadays, it seems to be the fashion to be nostalgic in Britain about the past. And we see movies like Their Finest Hour about Winston Churchill, we see movies like Dunkirk. And both of these movies celebrating a past war as if it was a desirable thing. And those of you who've ever been involved in any war will know that if you're fighting in a war, when you come out of it, you don't ever want to go back into another war again. And yet it's always the people who have never fought in a war who seem to be the most nostalgic for it. The 40-somethings who've never served in any field of battle at all will gleefully look back and think of Dunkirk and Churchill as both a glorious time and a glorious, almost godlike leader. Churchill was nothing of the sort. He was a bloodthirsty man. He was heavily bigoted, particularly hated coloured people, hated India in particular, and was quite happy to drive tanks through the streets of Glasgow to put down a union strike. So the way people look at British history, particularly in England, is coloured largely by nostalgia, something which is not shared here in Scotland, I don't think. However, on top of this particular essay, which was a brilliant piece of writing, the BBC had brought in somebody to comment on it, and they brought in a man who was the sole survivor, or one of the sole survivors, of a ship which was destroyed during the Falklands War. He was the last man off the ship. He undoubtedly was a brave guy, but when he was talking about this subject, he came up with something which I almost laughed out loud when I heard him say this, because the presenter was asking him about past glories and the racism of things like the British in India or the British in China. And he said something which caused me to laugh out loud. It's very rare for me to do. He said, yes, he said some aspects of racism were a bit unpleasant. Some aspects of racism are a bit unpleasant. This struck me instantly as somehow there's a pleasant form of racism that's okay in the British mindset. That this man could come out and say that some parts of racism were unpleasant, and yet must be some other parts of racism were okay. It was a remarkable thing to say on a radio show for anybody, particularly somebody who was representing at the time the British Armed Forces in the Falklands, and coming on the show as a guest to discuss why the British are so nostalgic for their past and how they very conveniently gloss over the real truth of situations. I mean, I'm reminded of an article I read recently about the real truth behind William of Orange. William of Orange was a Dutch prince who invaded the UK, and yet the British have spun this as a major victory for Britain, despite the fact that this foreign leader came into England and usurped their king and removed him and fought bloody battles all over the United Kingdom to cement his reign, and yet history has spun him into a great hero of the British Empire, not because of anything fantastic that he had done, but simply because he made sure that the Protestant majority in Britain got the king that they wanted, even if he was an invader. There are also a lot of aspects of the royal family which are worth scrutinising as well. There were documentaries recently about the Prince of Wales during World War II, who mysteriously took a flight to Iceland with some top RAF pilots and crashed inexplicably into the scenery of the Highlands for no apparent reason with all the engines at full bore. He seemed to have been taken out because he had sympathies with a plot, and it was a plot where the Germans were going to do a deal with the British so that the British would become allies. But it seemed like the Secret Service got to George first, sabotaged his plane and made sure that he went down with it. So there have been, and there still are, all kinds of very shady and unpleasant truths in the British past, not least of which is the way during the war that Scottish soldiers were basically squandered. They were sacrificed. On the beaches at Dunkirk, you'll notice in the movie Dunkirk, the beaches were very quiet. There was not much activity, there wasn't much fighting, and that was because Scottish regiments were holding the rear guard and were fighting the Germans and holding them back so that the men could be lifted off the beaches. And yet that movie never mentioned that fact. And yet those men were the real heroes. I've no doubt there were heroics on the beaches of Dunkirk as well, but the men who were killed and those who were captured defending the rearguard and allowing the expeditionary force to get off the beaches are never mentioned. And yet it was Churchill's decision to allow those men to be basically cannon fodder. They were there to hold up the Germans at any cost, even to themselves, to fight to the death or until they're captured or ran out of ammunition. So what I'm saying here is that the British have a thing about, I say British, I really mean the English have a thing about nostalgia for a better time and a golden era, which is a myth, really. It's a complete myth. Britain's been invaded umpteen times, and every time there was an invasion, it went down in history as a glorious success for the British nation. It wasn't. But history is written by the winners. That's the point. Whoever wins the day gets to write their version of history, and that is what's taught in English schools. In Scottish schools, we were always taught British history when I was a boy. Scottish history was glossed over. We weren't allowed to know what happened in Scotland. There were some brief discussions about things like Wallace and Bruce, but we were never told actually how the Wars of Independence started, what Edward did, what the atrocities were that led to these battles. These things were glossed over. However, and I'm getting off on a tangent here, the point of the show really is that we now face an uncertain future, and yet while Scotland is looking ahead to trying to build a new country with new industries, and to build a social society which is cohesive and where the wealth of the nation that's being made from its exports is more evenly shared amongst the people who are earning it. While we're looking ahead to doing that, the rest of the United Kingdom is looking backwards towards the war, and they're pulling up the drawbridge. They're leaving Europe. The continent that they helped to fight to free, they're now abandoning it, and they're going cap in hand to America looking for a bung, looking for a handout. Or if they can't get anything from America, they're going begging to China, again a country which Britain has a terrible past with, where Britain did all kinds of terrible, unpleasant, nasty things in China, including deliberately smuggling and forcing opium into China as a part of their policy of keeping the Chinese down and making sure that we had a stranglehold over the opium trade and the silk trade. Britain has a terrible history. And I say Britain in the loosest sense, I really mean England, because England was the country which drove everything. It did have a lot of successes. It was a notable sea power, for example. And as a sea power, there was nothing to beat the British Navy at one time. Sadly, that is no longer the case. The British Navy is now just a fragment of what it once was. And in the news this morning, we hear that there are plans to cut the Royal Marines by about 50%, I believe. And one or two people have been coming on saying we can't possibly afford to lose the Royal Marines, because how would we land our invasion forces on some foreign beach if we needed to? The problem is that our army is so small, it's almost a joke now. We couldn't launch an invasion of anything bigger than the Isle of Man at the moment. We don't have enough ships to protect our own coastlines. And as I say, the British state is looking backwards. We're watching movies about World War II, and the very same people who enjoy this nostalgia are voting for Brexit because they want to go back in time. They want to go back to the 50s, when Britain wasn't in the EU, when it had a Commonwealth, when it traded with places like Australia, New Zealand and South Africa. And they're trying to recapture that, but it's a time that's gone. And in my opinion, I don't think you can plan a future when you're looking backwards over your shoulder and having, glad-handing and patting yourselves on the back for what a great job you did 60 years ago or 100 years ago. The point is, what are you going to do now? And that is not being addressed. What we're seeing in the media, what we're seeing on the television screens, what we're seeing in the cinemas, is all what we would call bread and circuses. It's being fed to us to keep us happy, take our minds off the imminent collapse of the British economy and the fantastically stupid decision that's been made to Brexit. All the time looking to the past glories, waving the flag, make Britain great again. Britain isn't going to be great. It never really was great. The word great was only used to describe the large island. It's like Great Cumbria and Little Cumbria. That's the difference. Britain is not great. It's a small, crowded island which is drowning in debt at the moment. And Scotland, for its part, will be well clear of it when we separate, because we have a future which we know is going to be sustainable and is going to be fair. And we're going to be trading with lots of people, and we're going to keep our trade with Europe. We're not going to cut ourselves off from the rest of the world. And I think it's a shame that the people in England are looking backwards so much. Anyway, I have to go and do some work, but I thought this is a programme really that I wanted to make, and it's really just about how we view ourselves. In Scotland, we know our history and we're proud of it, but we look forward. We are inventive, we are innovative people, we are intellectuals. We talk about the future, we have a great sense of humour, but we are creative, and we're not going to stand still and look back at our history and wallow in it. I'll see you later. Have a good Sunday.